All right, so I thought I would film a short video this morning about how I'm coping with the mud and the frozen ground and the weather where I am here in Western Canada. It's been the craziest non-winter, if I can call it that. We had about a week and a half of really cold -28 weather. It was -10 today, or overnight. So this morning it's going to warm up to 0 degrees this afternoon. So we're just kind of coming out of that deep freeze. But before that, we've had the mildest, most beautiful winter with not a lot of snow, which is rare for us. I mean, we don't get as much snow as they do up in northern Canada or northern BC, but for us, we've had very minimal snow. So what that's meant is a lot of mud. And then when that mud freezes, super frozen, lumpy ground that is really hard for the horses to traverse. And, you know, it would be great if we all had infinite budgets and we could put in the crusher rock and, you know, the mud base and the landscape fabric and all of the base on top of that to have adequate drainage and keep everything, you know, from getting muddy and lumpy so that when it freezes, it's smooth. But I personally don't have that budget, so I have to deal with what I have. And my property is at the base of the mountain, so we get everybody's drainage. We're the last place to dry. So, you know, we have the implications of that. I am a little bit fortunate that my horses' track system, where they spend most of their time, is at the back of my property up on the more elevated hillside. Down here, we're on the flat with the arena and the boarding paddocks, but where I feed mine is a little bit elevated. So even though it does get super muddy and they're churning up the mud in the poop, it's maybe not as bad as it gets down here. So some of the things I do to combat the hard frozen ground, like my water is at the bottom way down here and they eat way at the top. So my horses have to traverse that track a few times a day to get their water. When the ground is frozen super lumpy and treacherous, I know they don't make as many trips as they probably would like to. So I make a point of getting them out and putting them in down at the water end so they can have a drink and make the journey back up. You know, only if I'm really not seeing them move. For the most part, even though they don't like to make the journey, they still do it because they know what they need. And I think, you know, obviously preventing colic and dehydration is really important, but at the same time, I think our perception of perhaps how often horses need to drink, you know, is a little bit skewed. When we were studying the wild horses and trekking after them in the Oregon desert, I mean, those horses can go up to 48 hours without finding a water hole. Now, that's not optimal, and I'm not saying don't water your horses. I'm just saying, you know, typically I see my horses come down 2 to 3 times a day each to drink, usually in a couple of groups. So if I see them only come down once or twice, I'm not panicking. But if I haven't seen them, you know, come down at all, or they're making the trip, you know, very infrequently, then I'm going to help out a little bit. And you know what, in a perfect world, again, with the infinite budget, if I had the ability to water them up the back when the track got that treacherous, I would absolutely do that. I just don't have that option back there with my ground and where my water lines are. One of the other things that I see a lot is they tend to stock up a little bit in their legs because their movement is restricted and they're used to such, you know, such movement on that track. I keep my arena salted in the winter, so the top layer of sand is soft, and I groom it all the time, almost every day, to make sure that top layer doesn't freeze and stay soft so I can work them or ride. And so I make a point of bringing them down and either turning them out or doing some groundwork if I'm not riding, and working them in that soft sand so I can keep their muscles in their body moving, their joints lubricated, you know, and I think it helps for their mental health too, because if they're on that hard frozen ground all the time and they can't get any type of reprieve, it's got to be hard on the muscle system, creating tension and brace and all of that in their body. And then the other part too is you can help them out a little bit if you've got boots and pads, even though you'll have to check them to make sure they're clean and dry inside. Boots and pads on that super frozen lumpy ground can be really helpful as well. It can just help kind of cushion the hardness of the surface a little bit for them. Even though it's still really hard for them to walk and traverse if it's deep like mine, it definitely helps, especially for those thin-soled horses or any, like for me, the rehab horses that I get in that are foundered and whatnot. It really helps them. soon enough, I will be spreading, not so much on my track, but in my borders paddocks that are frozen, I'll be putting in a new layer of what we call hog fuel, which is like a really coarse mulch, and that packs down and absorbs the water and kind of keeps it from getting muddy, and it keeps it a smooth surface. But the problem is right now, even though it's really frozen and lumpy and it'd be wonderful to put it in there, as soon as that ground thaws and all that moisture comes up, all my hog fuel would just get turned into the mud and be wasted. So I have to actually wait for the surface to thaw, the water to come up and be absorbed a little bit before I can start to put that hog fuel down. So I'm probably about another month away from that where I am here. But that's kind of my process. And again, you know, if I had planned on keeping these boarding paddocks permanently forever, I might consider, you know, the drainage rock and the crusher dust and the gravel on top. But I'd like to keep the surface as, you know, as soil friendly as possible and not have to scrape all that gravel out at some point, because I do plan on turning that into another pasture at some point in the long-term future. So for me, the hog fuel is the better option, because that's just going to decompose. Even though I have to top it up every year or two, depending on the wear, it's just a much more useful option for me. I personally love the hog fuel. It does not eliminate the mud altogether, but it's sitting on a clay base here where my paddocks are, and it holds the moisture. So even though it's wet, the horses don't churn up the clay and they don't create a mud, they create a wet hog fuel. So it's like wet sawdust on their feet. So I'm not escaping the moisture, but I am mitigating it a little bit. That dries really quickly, it harrows really nice, and then when I bring the horses in and they dry off, that hog fuel brushes off super quick. It's not like the mud crust they get if they were laying in the clay, like some of mine have in the on the track right now, because it's so muddy. They have a lot more mud to deal with. So again, too, in the next week or so, when we get a few days of consistent above zero temperatures, I take my tractor up that hillside and I box grade all the mud and dirt off, and the poop. I do that a couple of times a year, 2 or 3, whenever it needs it. And I scrape the top about 6 inches of, it's a mix, it's mostly poop, but a mixture of poop, mud, and stuff that gets churned up, and some old hay. And so I'll scrape all that down to the base. Under the one tree where they all like to hang out and sleep, I'll put some hog fuel there just to make it soft for them. And then, you know, they'll be a little bit better off. At some point this year too, I'd like to put a few gravel, well, top up the gravel areas of my track, because over the years it's been churned in. But the logistics of my track, I can't gravel the entire thing. It's too long. And some of the places it just doesn't work. So I tend to pick the worst, muddiest areas, and those are the ones I've been building up with gravel. I like to alter the terrain of my track too. So some of the areas are like a 3/4 inch crush, some are 1.5 inches. Other places it's the really nice soft hog fuel. I've got a few sandy areas. It's really important to think about variety for my horses' feet, because I want to rehabilitate these horses to be comfortable on all different terrains. So I can't just keep them on a soft ground all the time. I ride in a soft sand arena, but I like to trail ride up the mountain where it's full of rocks and shale and all kind of stuff like that. So I can use boots or composites when needed, but the more I can condition their feet, the less hoof protection I'm going to need, because their feet will be stronger and more adapted to it. So I just wanted to kind of cover those points. To sum it up real quick, make sure you give them a bit of a break. If you have an arena or a pasture area or even a driveway that you can get them out and help them have a little bit of movement to free up the tension in their body, that would be really great, obviously within reason. And you know, boots, if you have them, can be really helpful. Otherwise, we just have to wait it out. I mean, it would be wonderful, like I said, if we had infinite budgets or if we could control the weather. But until we figure out how to do that, we just have to make the best of the situation. So I'd like to stay positive. The sun is shining today, so it's lovely. It's only a couple more weeks of this chilly, cold, frozen ground, and then we're going to be complaining about the real soft mud. So I'm not really in a rush to do that. I'm just making the best of the situation that I have. So good luck out there. I hope it works for you. And if you have any great tips that you want to share, post them in the comments and let me know how you manage the mud. I know I had someone tell me the other day they get old rugs and they put the rugs down outside of their barn where the muddiest areas are for their horses. And that looked like it worked really well too. So if you could collect some old rugs, that might be a great way to repurpose them. All right, have a great day.